Sometimes a story starts so small, in a tiny tailor shop in a city like Udaipur, but then it just spirals into a national tragedy. This is one of those stories. And it's a case that really forces us to confront this terrifying link between online words, real-world violence, and a family's agonizing wait for justice.
Okay, just a quick heads up before we dive in. The details of this case are, well, they're graphic and deeply unsettling. So please be advised as we move through this. So, let's start with the man at the very center of all of this, Kanhaiya Lal Teli. This is Kanhaiya Lal Teli. He was a local tailor, just living a modest life, serving his community there in Udaipur. By all accounts, he was an ordinary guy, far from any kind of major controversy.
But that ordinary life was about to get completely turned upside down, and it all started with a digital spark that was about to ignite a real-world fire.
So, what was the trigger? According to reports, it was a social media post that was shared from Kanhaiya Lal's account, and this post showed support for Nupur Sharma, a politician whose comments about the prophet had already kicked off a massive controversy across the country. And the escalation was just terrifyingly fast. In early June, the post goes up. By the middle of the month, Kanhaiya Lal is getting death threats. So on June 15th, he did what any of us would do. He went to the police and filed a formal complaint, telling them about the danger he was in.
Now, despite that police complaint, Kanhaiya Lal reopened his shop, and that decision, well, it would lead directly to the horrific events that followed.
The date was June 28th, 2022. And this didn't happen in the middle of the night. We're talking broad daylight, around 2:45 in the afternoon, right in the middle of a totally normal workday.
Two men walked into a shop, pretending to be customers. One of them even created a distraction by asking to have his measurements taken. And then they attacked him with cleavers. And here's the part that is just so chilling. The second attacker filmed the entire gruesome act on his phone.
The attackers made no attempt to hide their motive. In that video they recorded, they used a slogan which translates to, "The punishment for an insult to the prophet is separation of the head from the body." They were explicitly stating their religious justification for murder right there on camera.
The act itself was brutal, but what they did next just amplified the horror tenfold. They posted the video online. It went viral almost instantly, forcing authorities in Udaipur to shut down internet services and impose a citywide curfew just to try and prevent more violence from breaking out.
So, with the city on lockdown and the entire nation just in shock, the investigation began, surrounded by this huge wave of public outcry. Now, while the local police made the initial arrests, the case was very quickly handed over to the NIA. That's India's National Investigation Agency, and they handle crimes related to terrorism. That move alone tells you everything. Authorities saw this not as a random act of violence, but as a calculated act of terror.
And that initial response was swift. The two primary accused, the men in the video, were identified as Mohammed Riaz Attari and Ghaus Mohammed, and they were arrested within just a few hours of the crime.
A swift arrest, however, doesn't always mean swift justice, and that brings us to the next and maybe the most frustrating chapter of this story.
More than 2 years have now passed since the murder. Let that sink in.
The victim's son has actually pointed out this incredibly painful contrast. A movie about his father's murder was made and publicized, yet the actual murder trial, it's still bogged down in procedural delays. For the family, the cinematic story has literally moved faster than real-world justice.
So, why the long wait? Well, it's a few things. There are these persistent procedural delays in the trial. There's the fact that some of the co-accused have even received bail. And all of this is leading to a growing frustration from both the victim's family and even political leaders, who are criticizing the slow pace of the legal process.
The impact of this murder goes so far beyond the courtroom, it raises these really difficult questions for society as a whole.
In this case forces us to ask a really tough question. What can the story of one tailor from Udaipur truly teach an entire nation?
Well, this tragedy reveals some pretty sobering truths. It shows how any ordinary person can get caught in this horrifying spiral of ideology and violence. It exposes that dangerous intersection of free speech and religious offense in our digital age, and it reminds us that for a victim's family, the suffering doesn't end with the crime. That agonizing wait for justice becomes its own form of torment.
And this leaves us with one final lingering question. Because this wasn't just a murder, it became a national symbol. And when a crime takes on that kind of meaning,
What does justice truly look like? Is it just a verdict in a courtroom, or is it something more? A fundamental change in the society that allowed it to happen in the first place?